What if a god who had ruled galaxies for 30,000 years suddenly awoke in a universe that didn't know his name, where physics bent to absurdity and the strongest beings wore capes instead of power armor? What if the master of mankind, the emperor himself, found his absolute authority challenged not by chaos or Xenos, but by a bald man in a yellow suit who could end fights with a single punch? The sky above City Z tore open at 1437 local time, not with thunder or the scream of descending metal, but with a silence so profound that every living thing within 50 kilometers felt their hearts skip in unison. Then came the light, gold and white and searing, a pillar that burned from ground to stratosphere, turning asphalt to glass and concrete to vapor in a perfect circle 200 meters wide. The Hero Association's continental sensors spiked past every known threshold. Seismographs registered nothing. Radiation detectors screamed and died. Every camera trained on the epicenter recorded only blinding static. What if, when that light finally collapsed inward, folding into itself like a dying star, what remained was not a meteor or a monster, but a man who radiated power that made reality itself uncomfortable? He stood at the crater's heart, impossibly tall, naked to the waist, and bleeding from wounds that wept light instead of blood. His skin was the color of old bronze, scarred and etched with symbols that moved when not observed directly. His eyes blazed gold twin suns, set in a face that was both ageless and ancient, beautiful and terrible in equal measure. No armor, no weapon, only presence. A gravitational weight that pressed against reality itself, bending the air into halos and making the ground beneath him hum with invisible power. He took one step forward, and the crater deepened. He exhaled, and 3 buildings 2 blocks away collapsed, as if struck by an unseen fist. In the depths of Hero Association headquarters, 70 stories beneath City A, Dr. Yusuke Kuseno stared at telemetry that made no sense. His screens displayed atmospheric pressure anomalies that should have flattened the entire district, gravitational distortions, electromagnetic cascades with no source, and something else, something his instruments had no name for, a field effect that his sensors could only describe as psychic interference, though such terminology had been relegated to crank science for decades. He reached for the emergency line. His hand trembled. "Priority Alpha," he said, his voice cracking. "Unknown entity manifestation. City Z. Threat level. God." The word felt inadequate. What if the first hero to respond was a cyborg who had faced countless monsters, yet had never encountered anything that made his combat processors return cascading errors? Genos descended toward the crater's edge, turbines screaming. His sensors analyzed the figure and returned impossibilities heat signatures that eclipsed recorded dragon-level disasters, biometric readings that classified the entity as simultaneously human, non-human, and something orthogonal to both categories. He hovered at 300 meters, incineration cannons charging. "Unidentified entity," Genos transmitted, his voice amplified. "You have caused extensive property damage and triggered a continental alert. Identify yourself or face immediate neutralization." The figure turned his head slowly, as if noticing the cyborg for the first time. Those golden eyes focused, and Genos felt his targeting systems lock not his doing. Something external had seized control of his optical sensors, forcing them to meet that gaze. For 3 seconds, Genos experienced something his mechanical nature should have rendered impossible. Terror. Pure. Primal. The kind that preceded extinction events and the death of worlds. Then the figure spoke, and his voice was layered 1,000 tones woven into one, resonating not through air but through bone and steel, and the silent spaces between thoughts. "I am the Emperor of mankind," he said, and the words landed like judgments. "And this world is mine now." Genos opened fire. Every weapon system activated simultaneously: incineration cannons, missile batteries, experimental plasma cores, all unleashing destruction sufficient to level a small city. The barrage struck true, a firestorm that consumed the crater and everything within. Smoke rose, dust choked the air. For 5 seconds, nothing moved. Then the smoke parted, not blown aside, but repelled, fleeing from the space the Emperor occupied. He stood unmoved, one hand raised. Genos understood with horrible clarity that the figure had not dodged, had not shielded himself with technology or armor. He had simply refused to be harmed. Physics had bent. Causality had negotiated. "You are a construct," the Emperor said, his tone carrying neither anger nor approval, only statement of fact. "A machine given thought, admirable in its way. Yet you serve no higher purpose. You fight without understanding why." Genos felt pressure building around him, an invisible vice tightening on his chassis. Actuators groaned. Armor plating cracked. His right arm, the one housing his most powerful cannon, began to crumple inward, metal folding like paper under the grip of an unseen hand. What if salvation arrived not in the form of superior technology or greater firepower, but in the shape of overwhelming simplicity? A fist crashed into the Emperor's jaw from the side, moving faster than Genos could track. The pressure vanished instantly. The Emperor staggered one step, two, his head snapping back from the impact. Genos fell, turbines firing desperately to slow his descent, and crashed into rubble 200 meters away. Through failing optics, he saw who had struck the blow. Saitama stood between Genos and the Emperor, wearing his usual hero costume and an expression of mild confusion. His fist was still extended, knuckles smoking faintly from the friction of movement. "That was kind of mean," Saitama said, glancing at Genos. "He was just doing his job." The Emperor straightened slowly, one hand rising to touch his jaw. Golden blood or something that resembled it dripped from the corner of his mouth. He stared at Saitama with an intensity that seemed to drill through layers of reality, searching, analyzing, attempting to comprehend what manner of being could deliver such force with such casual ease. "Interesting," the Emperor said softly. "You possess no psychic imprint, no aura of power, no connection to the currents of fate or the architecture of destiny. Yet you struck me. How?" Saitama scratched his head. "I punched you. Not complicated." The Emperor took a step closer. The ground beneath him fractured, cracks spreading outward in geometric patterns that hurt to observe. "I am the master of mankind, the anathema, forged in the fires of human will across 30,000 years of history. I have broken gods and reshaped worlds. I am psychic might incarnate, and you—" He paused, eyes narrowing. "You are nothing, a void, a statistical impossibility wearing human skin." "Okay," Saitama said. He assumed a basic fighting stance, something he'd learned from a martial arts manual years ago and rarely needed. "But if you're going to hurt people, I'm going to have to stop you." The Emperor smiled then, a terrible expression devoid of warmth. "Show me then, Void. Show me the limits of your impossibility." What if the battle that followed redefined what the Hero Association thought was possible, even in a world where S-class heroes routinely performed miracles? The Emperor moved, crossing 20 meters in the span between heartbeats, and drove his fist towards Saitama's chest. The air detonated. Shock waves flattened everything within a 100-meter radius, tearing buildings from their foundations and hurling debris into low orbit. Saitama blocked with one hand, palm meeting knuckles, and the force transferred through him into the earth below. The crater doubled in size, tripled, quadrupled. Seismic waves radiated across the continent. In City A, skyscrapers swayed. In City B, emergency alarms wailed as fault lines stirred. Saitama pushed back, not a punch, just a shove, and the Emperor flew backward, tumbling through the air before righting himself with a gesture. He hung suspended 30 meters up, breathing hard, eyes blazing brighter now. And Genos, struggling to his feet, realized with horror that the Emperor was not injured. He was excited. "Again," the Emperor commanded, and descended like a meteor. What followed was violence on a scale the world had never recorded. They clashed in the crater, then above it, then across the ruins of City Z. Each exchange of blows produced destruction that redefined the landscape. The Emperor fought with precision, born of millennia strikes, aimed at pressure points, joints, nerve clusters that should have paralyzed or killed any opponent. Saitama fought like he always did, with basic punches and simple movements. No technique, no style, just overwhelming physical superiority married to complete nonchalance. Buildings evaporated. Streets became canyons. The sky itself seemed to recoil from their conflict, clouds dispersing in perfect circles above wherever they fought. The Emperor adapted, His attacks shifted from physical to psychic. He reached into the space where Saitama's mind should be and found nothing, an absence so complete it felt like staring into a black hole. He tried to manipulate Saitama's biology, to stop his heart, to boil his blood, to shut down neural pathways. Each attempt slid off without effect, unacknowledged and irrelevant. He summoned fire from thought alone, psychic flames that burned at temperatures exceeding any natural process, and Saitama walked through them, his hero costume singed but his skin unmarked, looking vaguely annoyed. "Are we almost done?" Saitama asked, dodging a punch that carved a trench 3 kilometers long. "I think there's a sale at the supermarket today." What if the Emperor's frustration led him to unleash power that threatened not just the city, but the fabric of reality itself? The Emperor roared, a sound that shattered windows across 3 cities and unleashed his full might. His psychic presence expanded, no longer contained, flooding outward in a wave that touched every mind within 100 kilometers. Civilians collapsed, unconscious. Heroes faltered, their thoughts suddenly not their own. Monsters, those lurking in sewers and abandoned districts, began to change. Their bodies warped, flesh twisting into new configurations as the Emperor's power rewrote their genetic code, elevating them, transforming them into something more dangerous, more terrible, suffused with energies they could not comprehend. In the ruins of what had been a shopping district, a tiger-level monster named Rafflesidon, a plant-based creature of modest threat, felt the Emperor's power wash over it. Vines thickened, thorns lengthened, and from somewhere deep in its rudimentary consciousness, new thoughts emerged, vicious and cunning, laced with something that tasted like madness. It grew, doubling in size, then tripling, roots burrowing through concrete to draw sustenance from deeper sources that shouldn't exist in this reality. Currents of energy the Emperor's presence had torn open. Within minutes, Rafflesidon had become a dragon-level threat. And it was not alone. Dr. Kuseno watched in mounting dread as reports flooded in from across the continent. Monster attacks, dozens of them, all occurring simultaneously, all exhibiting impossible power increases. His screens showed thermal blooms, psychic interference patterns, and what his analysts were calling corruption signatures, reality itself degrading in proximity to the transformed creatures. He issued evacuation orders. He dispatched every available S-class hero. And he knew with the certainty of a man who had spent his life studying disasters that this was only the beginning. Back in the crater, Saitama dodged another psychic blast and closed the distance. His fist drove into the Emperor's stomach, and for the first time, the master of mankind felt something approximating pain. Real pain. Not the phantom sensations of psychic warfare, but actual physical damage. He coughed golden blood and staggered back, one hand pressed to his abdomen, and felt ribs that should have been metaphysically invulnerable begin to crack. "You are more than you appear," the Emperor gasped, his voice strained. "More than physics allows. What are you?" Saitama shrugged. "Just a guy who's a hero for fun." The simplicity of the answer seemed to wound the Emperor more deeply than any blow. His expression twisted a mixture of incomprehension and something darker, a rage born not from injury but from the collapse of fundamental certainty. He had walked among humans for tens of thousands of years. He had guided their evolution, sheltered them, sacrificed pieces of his own soul to shield them from horrors beyond counting. And here stood a human who defied every law, every principle, every truth he had built his existence upon. "No," the Emperor said, his voice low and dangerous. "No, you cannot be random. You cannot be accident. There is purpose in all things. Design in every evolution, a grand pattern woven through causality itself. You are an anomaly, and anomalies are tumors in the fabric of destiny. You must be excised." He raised both hands, and the world screamed. Reality bent inward, a localized singularity forming around Saitama, gravity compressing, space folding, a psychic vortex designed to crush atoms into constituent quarks. Saitama stood at the center, looking mildly uncomfortable, his costume flapping in winds that should have rendered him into atomic paste. The vortex intensified, light bent, sound died, and Saitama took one step forward, then another, walking against the current, as if it were a stiff breeze. "This is getting annoying," he said, and jumped. The distance between them vanished. Saitama's fist collided with the Emperor's face, not a casual punch this time, but something closer to genuine effort. The impact produced a shockwave visible from space, a ring of displaced air that expanded at hypersonic speeds, flattening everything for 10 kilometers. The Emperor flew backward, tumbling through the sky, and crashed into a mountain range 50 kilometers distant. The mountains collapsed, peaks shearing off and sliding into valleys. What if, in that moment of defeat, the Emperor finally understood the fundamental nature of this strange universe? When the dust began to settle, the Emperor emerged from the rubble, standing but barely, one arm hanging limp, his face a mask of golden blood. He laughed then, a sound empty of joy. "I understand now," he said, speaking to himself as much as to his absent opponent. "This universe is broken, not fallen, not corrupted, simply broken. Physics here are suggestions. Causality is negotiable. And you," he spat blood, "you are the proof, the living argument against order." Saitama landed 20 meters away, having crossed the distance in a single leap. He looked almost apologetic. "Look, I don't know what your deal is, but you can't just show up and start wrecking stuff. People live here." "People," the Emperor repeated, the word bitter on his tongue. "I have spent eternity in service of people. I have burned stars to keep them warm. I have murdered my sons to preserve their future. And I arrive here, wounded, seeking refuge or respite, only to find a cosmos that mocks the very concept of order." He straightened, power gathering around him again, his wounds closing as psychic energy stitched flesh and bone. "If this universe rejects law, then I will impose it. If this reality cannot be ruled, it will be remade." He thrust his hands toward the sky, and every living thing within 500 kilometers felt the psychic call. Monsters answered first, drawn by instinct and the promise of power. They surged toward the Emperor's position, hundreds of them, low-level threats and dragon-class horrors alike, their bodies already twisting under his influence. But humans answered too. Ordinary civilians whose minds could not resist the weight of the Emperor's will, stumbling from their homes, from shelters, walking like sleepers toward the epicenter of his power. What if the Hero Association's finest had to face not just one overwhelming threat, but an army of corrupted monsters and mind-controlled civilians? Genos, his systems barely functional, transmitted emergency warnings across all Hero Association channels. All heroes. Code Black. Psychic domination event. Civilian casualties imminent. Requesting immediate S-class response. Tatsumaki arrived first, a green streak cutting through the air. She descended near Genos, her small form radiating power, and stared at the distant figure of the Emperor. Even from this distance, she could feel him, a psychic presence so vast it dwarfed her own abilities, like an ocean dwarfing a pond. She had never encountered anything remotely similar. Pride warred with pragmatism, and pragmatism won. "Cyborg?" she said, not looking at Genos. "Tell me everything." While Genos briefed Tatsumaki, Saitama walked toward the advancing horde of monsters. They came at him in waves, their bodies warped and enhanced, some bearing multiple heads, others breathing flames that burned without fuel, still others moving through dimensions, phasing in and out of visibility. Saitama punched them one at a time, methodically, each strike precise and lethal. Heads exploded, bodies disintegrated. Within 2 minutes, the first wave was eliminated, corpses scattered across the landscape in various states of destruction. But more came, and behind them, the civilians. Thousands now, their faces blank, eyes glowing faintly gold. Saitama stopped. He could punch monsters all day without hesitation, but civilians were different. He looked back toward where Tatsumaki hovered and shouted, "Little Tornado Lady, can you stop the people?" Tatsumaki scowled at the nickname but understood the urgency. She extended her power, a green aura enveloping hundreds of civilians at once, lifting them gently, carefully, holding them in place with telekinetic fields. The strain was immediate. The Emperor's influence fought her control, a constant pressure that turned what should have been simple manipulation into a battle of wills. Sweat beaded on her forehead. Blood trickled from her nose. "I can't hold them all," she said through gritted teeth. "There are too many." From Hero Association headquarters, Dr. Kuseno coordinated the response. Bang and Bomb arrived to assist with civilian evacuation, their martial arts proving effective at disabling mind-controlled citizens without lethal force. Atomic Samurai and his disciples formed a perimeter, cutting down monsters that slipped past Saitama. Metal Bat, Child Emperor, and Zombie Men converged on secondary hotspots areas where the Emperor's influence had spawned pockets of concentrated monster activity. Each hero fought brilliantly, pushing their abilities to the limit, and each realized with growing horror that they were losing. The Emperor stood at the center of the storm, arms spread wide, and drew power from sources this universe could not name. The boundary between dimensions thinned in his presence. Energies that had no right to exist here, psychic currents from a reality governed by different laws, began to bleed through. The sky above City Z darkened, not with clouds but with something else. A roiling purple-black miasma that hurt to perceive. Shapes moved within it, half-formed and hungry. Saitama looked up at the darkening sky and frowned. "That looks bad." He leaped not toward the Emperor, but toward the sky itself, fist cocked back. At the apex of his jump, 50,000 meters up, he punched. The shockwave inverted, a cone of displaced air that drove upward into the miasma, tearing through it like a bullet through tissue. The darkness recoiled, shapes dissolving, and for a moment blue sky appeared a circle of normalcy carved from the wrongness. Then the miasma surged back, thicker than before, and something emerged from it, a creature of no fixed shape, all teeth and eyes and appendages, that existed in too many directions simultaneously. It fell toward the earth, screaming in frequencies that shattered glass across 3 cities. Saitama punched it on the way down. The creature exploded, chunks of not quite matter scattering across the sky. But more were coming through. Dozens of them, a tide of warp spawn drawn by the Emperor's psychic beacon. Each one a disaster in its own right. And together they represented an extinction-level threat. What if the Emperor realized, too late, that his power had opened a door that threatened both universes? The Emperor watched them descend and felt something he had not experienced in millennia. Doubt, not in his abilities, but in his judgment. He had opened this door in desperation, seeking to establish a foothold, to build something in this chaotic universe that resembled the Imperium he had lost. But the warp did not discriminate. It responded to psychic resonance, and his power, unshielded and uncontained, was a resonance stronger than any beacon. He attempted to close the rift, to seal the boundary he had weakened, but the warp resisted. It had tasted this new universe and found it rich with potential, a realm where physics were malleable and order was suggestion. Saitama landed next to the Emperor, having descended from the sky with several demon corpses disintegrating in his wake. He looked at the taller figure, his expression no longer casual. "You need to stop whatever you're doing," Saitama said. "Now." The Emperor met his gaze. "I cannot. The door is open. The warp has found this reality. Even if I were to die here, the contamination would remain, growing, spreading, until your universe becomes as ours, a battleground between materium and immaterium. Then close it." "I am trying," the Emperor said, and for the first time, Saitama heard something like vulnerability in his voice. "But I am weakened. The journey here cost me more than you can comprehend. I need time, power, focus, and I have none of these while under assault." Saitama considered this for approximately 2 seconds. Then he turned to face the descending horde of demons and warp spawn. "I'll keep them off you," he said simply. "You close that hole in the sky." What if this moment of cooperation between absolute authority and absolute simplicity became the turning point? The Emperor stared at him, this impossible creature who defied every law of existence, and felt something shift in his understanding. Perhaps order and chaos were not the only axes upon which power could be measured. Perhaps in a universe broken enough, strength itself could become its own form of law. "Very well," the Emperor said, and sat down cross-legged in the rubble. He closed his eyes, turned his focus inward and upward, and began the most delicate psychic operation he had ever attempted. Saitama punched the first wave of demons, then the second, then the third. They came at him in varieties he could not name, some burning, some frozen, some shifting between states of matter, some existing partially outside conventional space. He didn't care. He punched them all. His movements were economical. No wasted motion. Each strike landing with the minimum force necessary to obliterate his target. Bodies rained from the sky, dissolving into psychic residue that stained the ground in colors that had no names. Tatsumaki, still struggling to contain the mind-controlled civilians, watched Saitama's aerial battle with something approaching awe. She had always known he was strong, impossibly so. But seeing him engage hundreds of entities simultaneously, each one radiating power signatures that registered as dragon level or above, put his abilities into a context she had never fully appreciated. He was not just strong, he was a singularity of strength, a localized repeal of natural law. Minutes passed. The demon tide did not slow. If anything, it intensified, as if the warp itself had taken notice of the resistance and committed greater resources. Horrors emerged that dwarfed the earlier spawn creatures the size of buildings, entities whose mere presence caused psychic backlash that knocked unconscious anyone within a kilometer who possessed even latent sensitivity. Saitama punched them. They died. In the eye of the storm, the Emperor worked. Sweat or something resembling it dripped from his face. His hands trembled. The psychic barrier he was constructing existed in dimensions beyond the physical, a lattice of will and purpose, and each layer required absolute concentration. A single flaw, a single moment of distraction, and the entire structure would collapse. He heard the battle raging around him, felt Saitama's impossible presence as a void that moved through the demon hordes like a shark through water, and marveled at the paradox. The strongest being he had encountered in two universes, and it possessed not an ounce of psychic potential. The barrier reached critical mass. The Emperor opened his eyes, now blazing so bright they cast shadows at noon, and spoke a word that was not sound but pure psychic imperative. The word meant close, or perhaps begone, or maybe simply no, but its meaning transcended language. The warp rift convulsed. The miasma recoiled, and slowly, agonizingly, the tear in reality began to seal. Demons still in transit shrieked as the passageway collapsed on them, their forms shredded between dimensions. Those already through found themselves cut off, stranded in a universe whose physical laws they could not fully manipulate. Saitama punched the stragglers, methodically clearing the sky. Within 10 minutes, the last demon fell, its body dissolving into psychic vapor that smelled of ozone and burning brass. The rift closed with a sound like a wound healing, and the unnatural darkness lifted. Blue sky returned. Sunlight felt warm again instead of oppressive. The Emperor slumped forward, catching himself with one hand, his body trembling from exertion. He had done it. The immediate crisis was averted, but the cost would linger. Saitama landed next to him, not even breathing hard. "Is it done? The rift is sealed?" "Yes," the Emperor said, his voice weak. "But the contamination remains. This world has been touched by the warp. That touch will spread slowly, perhaps, but inevitably. Monsters will continue to exhibit anomalous power increases. Humans with psychic potential will awaken, unguided and dangerous. And somewhere in the dark places of this world, entities will gather strength fragments of demonic essence that survived the closure. Can you fix it?" The Emperor laughed, a bitter sound. "Fix an entire universe? I am powerful, void, but I am not omnipotent. The damage is done. The best I can offer is mitigation, guidance, if this world will accept it. What if the resolution came not through conquest or submission, but through an unexpected offer of cooperation?" "That depends," said a voice from above. Tatsumaki descended, finally able to release the civilians now that the Emperor's direct control had waned. She looked exhausted, blood staining her upper lip, but her eyes were sharp. "On whether you're planning to try taking over again." The Emperor regarded her, this tiny creature, who had held back his influence through sheer psychic might, and inclined his head fractionally. "You have potential. Raw, undisciplined, but vast. In my Imperium, you would have been sanctioned, trained, molded into a weapon of terrible efficacy. I'm not interested in your Imperium, Tatsumaki said flatly. Answer the question. The Emperor considered. He had arrived seeking to impose order, to establish control, because control was all he had known for 30,000 years. But this universe was not his. These people, strange and chaotic and frustratingly resistant to psychic domination, were not his subjects. And perhaps, he thought, with the kind of weariness that came from carrying the weight of species across millennia, perhaps that was acceptable. I will not attempt conquest, he said finally, but neither will I stand idle, while this world tears itself apart from the contamination I introduced. I will offer my knowledge, my power, to those willing to learn. What you do with that offer is your choice. Tatsumaki studied him for a long moment, then nodded curtly and flew off toward Hero Association headquarters, presumably to report. Saitama remained, hands in his pockets, looking at the Emperor with an expression of mild curiosity. So, what are you going to do now? The Emperor looked around at the devastation, the crater that had become a canyon, the ruins of a city, the scars his presence had carved into this world. I will do what I have always done. Protect humanity, even if this humanity is not mine, even if they reject my methods. The imperative remains. It is what I was created to do. That sounds lonely, Saitama observed. The Emperor met his eyes, and for a moment the weight of countless centuries was visible in his gaze. It is the loneliest burden imaginable, and I would not wish it on anyone. Saitama nodded, as if he understood, though whether he truly did was impossible to say. Well, good luck with that. Try not to wreck any more cities, okay? He turned and began walking toward what remained of City Z's residential district, presumably heading home. The Emperor watched him go, this absurd, impossible being who had fought demons with his bare hands and emerged unscathed, and felt something he had not experienced in longer than he could remember. Hope. Not for himself, but for the potential of random chance, for the possibility that strength without purpose could still serve a purpose, that chaos itself might be a form of order too subtle for even him to perceive. What if the Emperor's exile to this strange universe became not a tragedy, but an opportunity for redemption and new purpose? In the months that followed, the Emperor of Mankind became an unlikely fixture in the One Punch Man universe. He established what he called a shola, a training facility for those who had awakened psychic abilities following the contamination event. The Hero Association, wary but pragmatic, provided resources and oversight. Tatsumaki became his most challenging and most accomplished student, her raw power finally given the discipline it had always lacked. The contamination proved manageable but persistent. Monster mutation rates increased by 17%. Psychic phenomena became common enough that the Hero Association created specialized response teams. But with the Emperor's guidance, humanity adapted. They learned to detect warp signatures, to purge corruption, to shield vulnerable minds. Saitama occasionally wandered into the Schola, usually looking for someone who had borrowed his grocery coupons or heard about a sale. The Emperor found these visits both bewildering and oddly comforting. Here was a being who had punched gods and demons with equal nonchalance, yet worried about discount vegetables. It was, in its own way, a perfect encapsulation of why this universe had survived where others fell, because it refused to take itself too seriously, even in the face of apocalypse. One evening, standing on the roof of his facility, the Emperor turned to Saitama, who had appeared uninvited as usual. I spent 30,000 years trying to impose order on chaos, the Emperor said quietly. I created empires, forged weapons, sacrificed everything I was to build something that would endure. And it all came to ruin. That sucks, Saitama said simply. Indeed. But here, in this broken universe where nothing makes sense, where a man can punch reality itself into submission, I find peace, not happiness, not satisfaction, but peace. Perhaps that is enough. Sounds good, Saitama replied. Then, after a moment, want to go get ramen? I know a place that's still open. The Emperor of Mankind, master of psychic arts, conqueror of galaxies, God among men, considered the invitation. Then, for the first time in millennia, he smiled genuinely. Yes, he said, I would like that. What if the most powerful being in one universe and the strongest man in another found common ground, not in conquest or combat, but in the simple act of sharing a meal? What if sometimes salvation came not from imposing order, but from accepting chaos? What if the answer to cosmic questions could be found in a bowl of noodles and the company of someone who never asked for power, but wielded it with absolute integrity? These were the questions the Emperor pondered as he followed Saitama down from the roof into a world that didn't need a god, but had found room for a teacher, a guide, a guardian, who had finally learned that true strength lay not in control, but in service freely given. And somewhere in the vast expanse of the multiverse, in a universe he could no longer reach, the Imperium he had built continued its endless war. But here, now, the Emperor of mankind was simply a man again, walking beside another man whose power defied explanation, heading toward a ramen shop that stayed open late. It was enough.